You won't believe what happened in my neighborhood. Imagine waking up on a quiet Saturday morning to the sound of a chainsaw in your yard, only to discover your own HOA president, Karen, trying to chop down your 100-year-old oak tree without permission. What started as an outrageous act of trespassing turned into one of the most shocking moments our community has ever seen, because that tree didn't just fall, it landed right on her own house. You won't believe what happened in my neighborhood the other week. Seriously, if someone else told me this story, I might not even believe them myself, but I lived through it, and let me tell you, it was one of the craziest mornings of my life. It all started on what was supposed to be a calm Saturday. I had planned to sleep in a little, maybe enjoy a quiet breakfast with coffee, and then spend some time working in my garden. But instead of waking up to birds chirping or the smell of pancakes, I woke up to something much harsher, the sharp, piercing buzz of a chainsaw. At first, I thought maybe I was dreaming. You know how sometimes your alarm clock sneaks into your dream? That's what I figured was happening. But when the noise kept going and even got louder, I realized it was very real. The walls of my bedroom were practically vibrating from the sound. Now, if you've ever heard a chainsaw early in the morning, you know how jarring it can be. It's not the kind of sound that blends into the background. It was so out of place that I immediately sat up, rubbed my eyes, and thought, wait a minute, who on earth is cutting wood at this hour? Then it hit me. The sound was coming from outside, from my yard. Confused and half awake, I stumbled out of bed and peeked through the blinds. What I saw made my jaw drop. There, right in my yard, was a man in work clothes, safety goggles on, revving up a chainsaw. He wasn't trimming a bush or cleaning up fallen branches. No, he was standing directly in front of my old oak tree, a tree that had been standing on my property for generations. And next to him, directing the whole operation like she owned the place, was none other than my infamous neighbor Karen. And not just any Karen. This was the Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA. The kind of neighbor who thinks her opinion is law. The kind who will stop at nothing to make sure everyone follows her rules, even if those rules aren't written anywhere. Let me paint a picture for you. Karen is the type who carries a clipboard around like it's an extension of her arm. She'll measure the length of your grass with a ruler, and if it's even half an inch taller than what she thinks it should be, you'll find a passive-aggressive letter in your mailbox the next morning. She once fined a family for leaving their Christmas lights up until January 2nd because she claimed it ruined the uniformity of the neighborhood. She's the reason most of us dread HOA meetings. But this was a whole new level of outrageous. I threw on my slippers and rushed outside, still in my pajamas. The sun was barely over the horizon, and I hadn't even had my coffee yet. But here I was, standing in my own yard, watching my neighbor give orders to some poor landscaper she had clearly hired to do her dirty work. And when I say my yard, I mean my yard. The oak tree she was pointing at wasn't on the property line. It wasn't even close. It was dead center in my backyard, as much mine as the house I sleep in. A tree I had grown up with, one that gave shade in the summer, a place for birds to nest, and a sense of history to the property. It wasn't just a tree, it was part of my home. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stormed up to them and shouted over the roar of the chainsaw, Karen, what on earth are you doing? She turned around with that smug little smirk she always wore, the one that screamed, I know better than you, and said something that left me absolutely speechless. Oh, don't worry, she said, waving me off like I was just being dramatic. I'm just solving a problem for the neighborhood. Your tree is overgrown, messy, and frankly dangerous. You should be thanking me. Thanking her? Was she serious? This woman had trespassed onto my property, hired someone to cut down my tree without even asking me, and now she expected gratitude? I stood there in disbelief. My tree wasn't overgrown. Sure, it was big, it was supposed to be. That oak had stood tall for decades, maybe a century, and it had never once posed a danger. In fact, it had survived storms that knocked over smaller trees in the area. And Karen calling it messy. Please. That was just her way of saying she didn't like raking leaves in the fall. But Karen didn't care about the truth. She never did. What she cared about was control. You see, this wasn't the first time Karen had tried to interfere in my life. She complained about the color of my shutters, even though they were HOA approved. She left me a nasty note about having a garden gnome in my flower bed, claiming it was tacky. And one time, when my trash can was left out for just a few extra hours because I got home late from work, she actually took a picture of it and emailed it to the entire HOA board. She lived for this kind of drama. It made her feel powerful. But now, she wasn't just meddling, she was crossing a line. The landscaper looked uncomfortable. He kept glancing between me and Karen, clearly realizing that something wasn't right. Ma'am, he said nervously. Are you sure this is your property? Because he seems pretty upset. Karen cut him off immediately. Don't listen to him. I'm the president of the HOA. I have authority to make these decisions for the neighborhood. That's when my jaw nearly hit the ground. The audacity. HOA rules cover things like trash cans, lawn care, fences, but they don't give anyone the right to march onto private property and start chopping down trees. She was bluffing, and she knew it. I stepped forward and told her firmly, Karen, this is my tree. On my land. You have no right to touch it. If you don't stop right now, I'll call the police. But do you think that fazed her? Of course not. She just crossed her arms, raised her chin, and said, You'll thank me later. That was the moment I realized Karen wasn't just nosy or controlling. She was reckless. She didn't care about rules, boundaries, or consequences. She only cared about getting her way, no matter who got hurt in the process. And in that moment, watching her point at my tree like she was the queen of the neighborhood giving orders to her servants, I knew something big was about to happen. Something that would finally show Karen, and everyone else, that her arrogance had limits. Because here's the thing about karma. It has a funny way of working faster than you expect. I shouted over the deafening buzz of the chainsaw, Karen, what do you think you're doing? The landscaper froze mid-cut, startled by my voice, but Karen didn't even flinch. She turned around slowly, with that smug little half-smile she always wore, the one that said I know better than you, and there's nothing you can do about it. She put one hand on her hip and, as calmly as if she were commenting on the weather, said, Oh, don't worry. I'm just solving a problem for the neighborhood. Your tree is overgrown, messy, and frankly dangerous. You should be thanking me. Thanking her? My blood pressure spiked instantly. This woman had the gall to trespass into my yard, hire someone to cut down a tree that had stood there for over a century, and now she was acting like she was doing me, and everyone else, a favor. I couldn't believe the audacity. This wasn't trimming a stray branch hanging over the sidewalk. This wasn't picking up trash that had blown across the street. This was a massive oak tree, one that provided shade in the summer, a home for birds and squirrels, and a beautiful backdrop to my house. My grandparents had picnicked under that tree. My kids had built a tree swing on one of its branches years ago. That tree wasn't just part of the yard. It was part of the family. And yet, here was Karen, acting like she had full authority to make decisions about it. I stepped closer, pointing at the tree, and raising my voice to make sure the landscaper heard me clearly. That tree is on my property. You can't touch it. The landscaper paused, lowering the chainsaw slightly. He looked caught in the middle, his eyes darting between me and Karen. He knew something wasn't right. After all, he'd been hired for the job, but it was becoming crystal clear he'd been hired by the wrong person. Is this your property, sir? He asked nervously. Before I could answer, Karen jumped in, cutting me off like she always did. She waved her hand dismissively, like she was swatting away a fly, and said, Don't listen to him. I'm the HOA president. I have authority here. This tree is a hazard to the neighborhood, and I'm dealing with it. Spoiler alert, she didn't. But the way she said it, with such confidence and authority, you could almost believe her if you didn't know any better. That's Karen's specialty, bluffing her way through situations until people cave in. Most neighbors had experienced it at some point. A letter taped to their door, a knock in the middle of dinner, or a confrontation in the driveway where she insisted something wasn't in compliance. Most people gave in, not because she was right, but because she was exhausting. But not this time. I squared my shoulders and said firmly, Karen, the HOA doesn't own my backyard. You don't get to decide what happens on my property. Put the saw down and get off my land. The landscaper hesitated again. His grip on the chainsaw loosened, and he took half a step back, clearly uncomfortable. He was a worker, not a lawyer, and this was sounding like a lawsuit waiting to happen. But Karen wasn't backing down. She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in the back of her head. She let out a dramatic sigh and barked at him like a drill sergeant. Keep going. Don't let him intimidate you. He doesn't understand how dangerous this tree is. If it falls in a storm, it'll damage half the block. I'm saving everyone money and trouble. I nearly laughed out loud at her logic. That oak had survived hurricanes, tornado warnings, ice storms, you name it. It was one of the sturdiest trees in the neighborhood. If anything, her roof would collapse before that tree ever fell. But that's the thing about Karen. Facts don't matter when she's decided she's right. I stepped closer to the landscaper, lowering my voice, so he could hear me clearly over the hum of the chainsaw engine. Listen, man, I didn't hire you. She doesn't own this property. If you cut that tree, you're committing trespassing and destruction of property. That's a criminal offense. You don't want to be part of that, do you? The landscaper's eyes widened. He swallowed hard and looked back at Karen. Ma'am, maybe we should stop and figure this out. I don't want to get into trouble. Karen snapped. Her voice shot up an octave, shrill and commanding. No, don't you dare stop. I told you. I'm the HOA president. I have full authority here. If you don't finish the job, I'll make sure you never work in this neighborhood again. That was Karen in a nutshell. Threats, intimidation, acting like she had the power to ruin people's lives if they didn't do exactly what she wanted. But I wasn't about to let her bulldoze this situation. Karen, I said sharply, cutting her off this time. You don't have authority on private property. The HOA covers common areas and maybe some exterior guidelines, but you cannot trespass and destroy something that doesn't belong to you. If you touch that tree again, I'll call the police right now, and I'll make sure they know exactly who hired you. For the first time, Karen's expression faltered. Just for a split second, the smugness slipped, and I saw a flash of panic. But like clockwork, she quickly put her mask back on, tilting her head and smirking like she still had the upper hand. You can call whoever you like, she said. By the time they get here, the tree will already be gone. The sheer arrogance floored me. She genuinely believed she could override my ownership of my own property by sheer force of will. I pulled out my phone and held it up in plain sight. Go ahead, try me. The second that saw touches my tree again, I'm dialing 911, and I'll press charges for trespassing, property damage, and harassment. Your HOA title won't mean a thing in court. The landscaper looked horrified now. He shut off the chainsaw completely, the engine sputtering into silence. The sudden quiet made the whole situation feel heavier, like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Karen whipped around to face him, her face turning red. Turn that back on. That's an order. But he shook his head quickly. No way, lady. I didn't sign up for this. If this is his property, I'm not cutting down his tree. I could lose my license, or worse. You want it gone, you cut it yourself. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She clearly wasn't used to people saying no. Finally, she turned back to me, her voice dripping with venom. This isn't over. You'll regret this. That tree is a liability, and I'll get it removed one way or another. You can't stop me forever. I couldn't help but chuckle at how desperate she sounded. Karen, the only thing that's a liability here is you. Now get off my property before I make that call. She glared at me like she wanted to burn a hole through my skull. For a moment, I thought she might actually double down and try to grab the chainsaw herself. But then, realizing she was outnumbered and out of options, she huffed loudly, spun on her heel, and stomped back toward her yard, muttering under her breath the whole way. The landscaper gave me a sheepish shrug. Sorry about that, man. She was pretty insistent. Won't happen again. I nodded. No hard feelings. But next time, maybe check who actually owns the property before firing up that chainsaw, huh? He chuckled awkwardly, packed up his gear, and drove off, leaving Karen fuming alone on her porch. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the kind of person to let go. She was plotting, waiting for her next move. And unfortunately for her, her next move would turn out to be her biggest mistake yet. Because when Karen finally tried again, things didn't just backfire. They literally came crashing down on her own house. Here's where karma came in fast. And when I say fast, I mean faster than anyone could have planned for. It was like nature itself had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to remind Karen that arrogance always comes with consequences. Now, let me explain something. The oak tree in my yard wasn't just any tree. It wasn't the kind you plant from a sapling and watch grow over a few years. This thing was ancient, towering, thick, and wide enough around that two people holding hands couldn't wrap their arms all the way around its trunk. Its branches stretched out like the arms of a giant, shading not just my yard, but a good part of Karen's property too. And here's the kicker. The tree leaned slightly in her direction. Not dangerously so, but enough that if you look from the street, you could see its canopy hanging over her roofline. Anyone with even the slightest bit of common sense would know that if you tried to bring down a tree like this, you'd have to be very, very careful. You'd need ropes, pulleys, maybe even a crane, and most importantly, someone who knew what they were doing. But Karen? She didn't care about planning, logic, or safety. She cared about control. And her idea of control was barking orders at the poor landscaper she had dragged into this mess. Just cut it quick, she told him, waving her hand like the tree was nothing more than a bush in her front yard. Her voice was sharp, impatient. You could tell she was getting nervous, probably worried I'd call the cops any second. She wanted this done fast, before she lost her grip on the situation. The landscaper hesitated. He looked at the tree, then at me, then at Karen. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. He knew this wasn't right. He knew the angle was wrong, the cut was sloppy, and that this was a disaster waiting to happen. But Karen was breathing down his neck, and some people, when pressured by someone like her, just go along with it. So he started cutting. The chainsaw roared to life, echoing through the neighborhood. Sawdust sprayed into the air like a golden mist, and the smell of fresh cut would fill the yard. With every second, I felt my stomach twist tighter. I knew what was about to happen. I could see it as clear as day. The tree groaned almost immediately. Not just a little creak. No. This was the kind of deep, resonant sound that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. It was the sound of something ancient being disturbed. Something too heavy and too old to be messed with carelessly. And sure enough, the trunk began to tilt. Not toward my yard. Not toward the open space, where it could have fallen safely. No, it leaned directly toward Karen's house. Stop, I yelled, my voice cutting through the chaos. You're going to drop it on her place. The landscaper froze mid-cut, the chainsaw sputtering as he pulled it back. His eyes were wide, panic written all over his face. He knew I was right. But then came Karen, arms crossed, chin raised, that smug little smirk glued to her face, as if she had everything under control. It'll be fine, she snapped. Keep going. Keep going. Was she insane? At this point, any rational person would have realized the danger, but Karen wasn't rational. She was blinded by her own arrogance, too stubborn to admit she might have made a mistake. The landscaper looked torn, his grip tightening on the chainsaw. He hesitated again, but Karen barked louder. I said keep going. And then it happened. With a sound like thunder cracking in the distance, the tree gave way. A loud crack echoed through the air as the trunk split. The earth trembled beneath our feet, and the massive oak groaned like a giant taking its final breath. Time seemed to slow. I watched, helpless, as the tree tilted more and more, its branches swaying, leaves rustling like 1,000 whispers. The landscaper stumbled back, eyes wide with horror, as the inevitable became clear. And then boom! The oak came crashing down right across Karen's roof. The sound was deafening, with splintering, shingles shattering, metal gutters twisting and snapping under the weight. A branch the size of a telephone pole punched straight through her upstairs window. The roof caved in with a sickening crunch, sending dust and debris billowing into the air. For a split second, there was silence. And then the neighborhood erupted. Doors swung open. People rushed out onto their porches, shielding their eyes from the cloud of dust. Gasps and shouts filled the air as everyone realized what had just happened. My phone buzzed in my pocket, neighbors texting me. Are you seeing this? As if I wasn't standing front row center to the entire disaster. I looked at Karen, Her face was pale, her mouth hanging open. The smug confidence was gone, replaced with shock and disbelief. She stood frozen in her yard, staring at the wreckage like her brain couldn't process what her own arrogance had just caused. The landscaper muttered under his breath, "Oh my God, oh no, no, no," before yanking off his goggles and backing away like the tree might somehow fall further and crush him too. He wanted no part of this anymore. Neighbors whispered to each other, some of them even chuckling behind their hands. After all, Karen wasn't exactly loved in the community. She'd spent years making everyone else miserable with her nitpicking and power trips. Now here she was, watching the literal consequences of her actions destroy her own house. I took a deep breath, trying to hold back a laugh. Part of me wanted to feel bad. Her house was badly damaged, after all. But another part of me knew this was exactly what she deserved. Karma doesn't usually work this fast, but when it does, it's a thing of beauty. Karen finally snapped out of her daze. She spun toward me, her face red with rage. "This is your fault," she shrieked, pointing at me like I'd been the one holding the chainsaw. "My fault." I raised my eyebrows. "Karen, you cut down my tree. On my property. I told you to stop. I warned you what would happen. You didn't listen. This is on you." She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died on her tongue as another branch slipped and fell, smashing onto the hood of her brand new SUV parked in the driveway. The windshield exploded into 1,000 tiny shards, and a collective gasp rose from the watching neighbors. At that point, Karen let out a sound somewhere between a scream and a sob. She stomped her foot like a child throwing a tantrum and shouted, "You'll pay for this. You'll all see," before storming into what was left of her house. The landscaper quietly packed up his chainsaw, muttering to himself the whole time. He didn't even look Karen's way. By the time he pulled out of the neighborhood, everyone knew he'd be giving the police a statement if it came to that. Meanwhile, neighbors began pulling out their phones, snapping pictures and recording videos. You could almost hear the captions being written in their heads. HOA president destroys her own house. Within hours, half the neighborhood group chat was buzzing with memes about the incident. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold. It wasn't my mess to clean up. For once, Karen's destruction hadn't landed on me. It had landed squarely on her. And let me tell you, the satisfaction of watching karma work in real time? Priceless. The once proud queen of the HOA stood frozen in disbelief as her own arrogance literally crushed her home. It was almost cinematic, the kind of moment you couldn't make up even if you tried. The tree had landed perfectly across her roof, like nature itself had drawn a bullseye on her house. A massive branch had punched straight through her upstairs window, shards of glass glittering across the driveway like diamonds. Part of the roof had caved in, leaving a jagged hole that exposed insulation and rafters. And as if the universe wanted to make sure the lesson was loud and clear, another heavy branch crashed onto her brand new SUV parked neatly in the driveway, shattering the windshield and denting the hood beyond recognition. It was pure chaos. The air was thick with sawdust and dust from broken shingles. Bits of leaves fluttered down like confetti. And Karen? She stood there, pale as a ghost, her jaw slack, her arms hanging at her sides. For the first time, she didn't look smug, or bossy, or superior. She looked small, defeated. Neighbors began spilling out of their homes, one by one. First a couple across the street, still in their slippers. Then the family next door, phones already in hand, filming like they'd just stumbled onto the most entertaining reality show of the year. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Whispers rippled through them. "Is that Karen's house? Oh my God, it crushed the roof. Wait, wasn't that his tree?" Someone whispered, pointing at me. I just stood there in shock, my heart still racing from the crash. My tree was gone. My yard looked like a logging site. But strangely enough, all I could feel in that moment was vindication. Karen snapped out of her frozen state and did what she always did. She tried to spin the story. Her face turned bright red, and she stomped her foot like an angry toddler. "This is your fault," she screamed at me, her voice cracking with rage. "If you had trimmed your tree like I told you, this never would have happened." The crowd murmured, some even chuckling under their breath, Nobody was buying it. We all knew the truth. She hadn't just complained about the tree. She had trespassed, ordered someone to cut it without permission, and ignored every warning until karma finally dropped the hammer. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, then spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Karen, you touched my property without my consent. This is on you. And I think you'll find your homeowner's insurance won't be too happy about the fact that you caused this yourself. That last part made her sputter like an overheated engine. Insurance? Don't you dare. This is your responsibility, she barked, but her voice wavered. She was losing ground, and she knew it. By now, the landscaper had completely backed away, his chainsaw sitting on the ground, forgotten. He shook his head, muttering to himself, I knew this was a bad idea, before fishing out his phone like he was about to call his boss, or maybe his lawyer. And then someone else called the police. I don't even know who did it. Maybe one of the neighbors who wanted the situation on record, or maybe the landscaper himself. But within 15 minutes, a patrol car rolled up, lights flashing. The officer stepped out, sunglasses on, surveying the scene with a raised eyebrow. He looked from the crushed house to the fallen tree to the stunned crowd, then finally to Karen, who immediately rushed at him like he was her savior. Officer, thank God you're here. This man is responsible for destroying my property. He neglected his tree, and look what happened. It fell on my house. He should be arrested. The officer held up a hand, calm but firm. Ma'am, slow down. Let's get the facts straight. Whose tree was it? Karen jabbed a finger at me. His. The officer turned to me. Sir, is that true? The tree belonged to you. I nodded. Yes, officer. The tree was on my property. But I didn't cut it. She did. The officer frowned. Cut it? What do you mean? I explained everything. The chainsaw, the landscaper, Karen trespassing without permission, and her insisting on taking down the tree against my protests. By the time I finished, a couple of neighbors chimed in, nodding and confirming what they'd seen. Even the landscaper reluctantly admitted. She hired me. I told her it didn't look safe, but she insisted. Karen's face twisted in outrage. They're all lying. They're ganging up on me because they don't like me. I'm the HOA president. I was just doing my duty. The officer raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, being in the HOA doesn't give you the right to enter someone else's property and remove their tree. That's trespassing and destruction of property. And considering the damage, you may be liable for tens of thousands of dollars. The silence that followed was deafening. You could practically hear Karen's ego deflating. No, this isn't fair, she stammered. That tree was a danger. I was protecting the neighborhood. The officer shook his head slowly. Ma'am, with all due respect, the only danger here was you making reckless decisions. You had no legal right to cut this tree. The damage to your house, that's on you. The crowd rippled with quiet laughter and whispers. A couple of neighbors even clapped softly, like they'd just witnessed the climax of a movie they'd been waiting for. Karen's face went through every shade of red. She looked like she wanted to scream, cry, and throw a tantrum all at once. But for once in her life, she was out of moves. She couldn't bully, bluff, or boss her way out of this. The officer finished his report, jotting down statements from me, the landscaper, and a few witnesses. When he was done, he tucked his notepad back into his pocket and gave Karen one last look. Ma'am, I strongly suggest you contact your insurance company. But be prepared. They're not going to be happy when they hear how this happened. That line hit her like a punch to the gut. Everyone knew Karen prided herself on her pristine home and her shiny new car. And now both were wrecked. And worse, she had to admit it was her own fault. She stormed back toward her house, muttering under her breath. The SUV sat in the driveway, glass everywhere, branches still weighing it down. Her once perfect lawn was littered with debris, and the crown jewel of her little empire, her house, now wore a giant oak tree like a crooked hat. As the police car drove off, neighbors lingered, shaking their heads and trading stories. One of them leaned over to me and whispered, "Looks like karma finally came for her." I just smiled, feeling a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. For years, Karen had terrorized the neighborhood with her rules and power trips. She'd find people for leaving trash cans out, scolded kids for riding bikes too fast, and even lectured me once for planting flowers she didn't consider aesthetically uniform. But now, she had no one to blame but herself. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset through the broken silhouette of my once great oak, I thought about what the officer had said. Insurance would cover some of it, maybe, but Karen's reputation? That was shattered beyond repair. And in a way, that was the biggest consequence of all. Because after this day, whenever anyone in the neighborhood saw her marching around with her clipboard, all they'd think about was the day she cut down someone else's tree and dropped it right on her own house. In the days that followed, word spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire in dry grass. It seemed like everyone knew the story by the end of the first day. People who had once lived under Karen's HOA reign of terror, neighbors who had been fined for having a slightly faded mailbox, lectured about trash cans, or warned about non-compliant garden gnomes, couldn't stop smiling every time they passed by her house. Her perfect image, the one she had spent years carefully building, had been shattered in one afternoon. Now her home was covered in big blue tarps, flapping in the wind, like a constant reminder of her mistake. Contractors came and went at all hours, dragging ladders, hammering shingles, and working on repairing the massive hole in her roof. The noise was constant, but instead of being annoyed, the neighborhood found it satisfying. And the bill? Oh, it wasn't small. Word got around, because in neighborhoods like this, word always gets around, that her insurance company was reluctant to cover everything. After all, this wasn't some natural disaster, storm, or accident. This was an act of recklessness, her recklessness. She had trespassed, hired a landscaper without permission, and pushed him to take down a tree that wasn't hers. The tree falling on her house wasn't a random accident. It was the direct result of her own stubbornness. Everyone estimated the damages were in the tens of thousands. The roof alone needed major structural repairs, not just a few new shingles. The upstairs bedrooms had water damage because the collapse left parts of her home exposed during a rain shower the very next day. Her brand new SUV had to be towed away, windshield destroyed, hood dented like a crumpled soda can. By the time the costs were tallied, Karen was staring at a financial hole almost as big as the one in her house. And the best part? She couldn't pin it on anyone else. For years, Karen had been a master at blame shifting. If a neighbor didn't follow her arbitrary HOA rules, she'd issue fines and tell the board it was for the good of the community. If kids played too loudly in the street, she'd scold the parents and claim it was a safety hazard. She always made herself look like the responsible one, the enforcer, the protector, the guardian of neighborhood standards. But this time, she couldn't twist the facts. The landscaper, who had been caught right in the middle of the chaos, was quick to protect himself. He gave a full statement confirming that Karen had pressured him into cutting down the tree, despite his hesitation. He explained how she barked orders, dismissed concerns, and insisted she had authority as HOA president. In short, he threw her under the bus, and who could blame him? He wasn't about to take the fall for her arrogance. And the HOA board? They wanted nothing to do with her mess. At the next community meeting, it was the first thing on the agenda. People were buzzing with anticipation, waiting to see how she'd handle it. When the moment came, Karen tried to stand tall, clipboard in hand, pretending like nothing had changed. But her voice trembled when she spoke. "I want to clarify," she announced, "that my actions regarding the tree were for the safety of the neighborhood. It was overgrown, dangerous, and—" She didn't even get to finish. Another board member cut her off. "Karen, let's be clear. The HOA never authorized that. You acted on your own." The room erupted in murmurs. Neighbors nodded, whispering to one another. One man in the back even laughed out loud. Karen's eyes darted around the room, desperate for support, but there was none. The very people she had once controlled with fines and warnings were now staring at her with smug satisfaction. The board distanced themselves immediately, issuing a formal statement. The HOA had no involvement in the unauthorized removal of a private homeowner's tree. That was it. No backup. No safety net. For the first time, Karen was truly alone. And slowly but surely, her power in the community started to crumble. It began with whispers. Neighbors who once feared her started openly mocking her. "Hey, maybe Karen can fix your fence for you. Just don't let her near a chainsaw." One man joked while walking his dog. Someone else made a meme out of a photo of her house under a tarp, captioning it, "HOA Standards, brought to you by Karen." The photos circulated in the neighborhood group chat, and even people who normally stayed quiet couldn't help but laugh. Her reputation as the all-powerful HOA president, the woman who could fine you for leaving your Christmas lights up too long, was gone. Instead, she was the neighborhood punchline. And the more she tried to claw back control, the worse it got. Every meeting, every attempt to reassert authority, was met with rolled eyes and smirks. Meanwhile, I found myself in a strange new position. People who barely spoke to me before suddenly came up to shake my hand, pat me on the back, and quietly thank me. Not because I had done anything, but because Karen had finally been knocked down a peg. I had become the accidental hero of the block, the guy whose tree took down the tyrant's throne. And honestly, it felt good. Of course, I still had to deal with the loss of my tree. That oak had stood for over 100 years, shading my yard, adding beauty, and giving me memories of summers spent reading under its branches. Watching it lie in splinters had hurt, but I refused to let Karen's actions end the story there. So, after the dust settled and the contractors finally cleared away the debris, I planted a new tree in my yard. This time, I chose a strong, healthy maple. It wasn't as massive as the oak, not yet, but it would grow tall and sturdy in time. And every time I watered it, I couldn't help but smile, remembering the day Karen's arrogance literally came crashing down on her own house. The maple became more than just a tree. It became a symbol, a reminder that no matter how loud, bossy, or controlling someone tries to be, they're never above the simple truth. Actions have consequences. Karen still lived in the neighborhood, of course. She wasn't about to move out, not after pouring all that money into repairs. But she was different now. Smaller, quieter. She still tried to enforce rules, but no one took her seriously anymore. And when she walked past my yard, she couldn't even look at the maple without her face tightening. It was like the tree itself mocked her every day. I didn't rub it in. I didn't have to. The whole neighborhood already knew the story, and the sight of that tarp-covered roof had been more humiliation than I could ever dish out. And that, I think, was the best ending I could have asked for. Because while Karen spent her days scrambling to rebuild her image, I spent mine watering my tree, chatting with neighbors who were suddenly friendlier, and enjoying the peace that finally returned to the block. For once, the HOA president wasn't feared, she was pitied. And the neighborhood? It finally felt like it belonged to all of us, not just her. Looking back, I realized something important. Karen's downfall wasn't just about the tree. It was about years of pent-up frustration, years of her pushing people around and acting like she owned everything. The tree was just the spark that set it all ablaze. And maybe that's why everyone enjoyed the fallout so much. It wasn't just that she wrecked her own house. It was that she exposed herself for who she truly was. And once the mask slipped, there was no putting it back on. As for me, I'll keep tending to my maple. One day it'll be tall enough to cast shade across the yard, just like the oak once did. But this time, it won't just be a tree. It'll be a story, a memory, a quiet reminder of the day arrogance met gravity and lost. And that's how karma finally caught up with Karen. The once feared HOA president became the neighborhood punchline, while I planted a brand new maple tree as a reminder that arrogance always comes crashing down. If you enjoyed this story of poetic justice, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more wild neighborhood tales, and ring the bell so you never miss the next one. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming.